This is KSL Sunday Edition with Boyd Matheson.
Welcome to Sunday Edition. I am Boyd Matheson. Each Sunday we attempt to divide the rage from the reason, elevate the conversation, connect the dots, and make the news make sense. We have conversations with great thinkers, great leaders, and great people making a difference. We talk politics so we can discuss society, and we explore society so we can discuss principles and the people in America who actually live them. We bring the best and brightest to Utah, and we send the Utah model to our nation's capital and beyond. And today we're going to do that in a big way. Dr. Jacqueline C. Rivers is the Executive Director and Senior Fellow for Social Science and Policy of the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies. She's lectured at Harvard, Princeton, Stanford, the Vatican, among many other institutions and crucial conversations. Reverend Eugene F. Rivers III is the founder and director of the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies and is a widely published writer and community activist who's lectured internationally as well. The Rivers are in Utah this week as guests of the Wheatley Institute at Brigham Young University, where Jacqueline delivered an extraordinary address on conceptions of the soul during the annual Truman G. Madsen Lecture on Thursday evening. Welcome to both of you. We are in for a real treat and a fantastic conversation. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. We're glad to be here.
I'm going to start with you, Dr. Rivers. In your address at the Wheatley Institute on Thursday evening, you talked about this conception of the soul, and at the conclusion, you talked really in essence of how do we heal some of the divide? How do we get past some of that? And I thought you were channeling your inner George Washington, who talked about the miracle of Philadelphia being based on amity, deference, and accommodation. You talked about it in terms of self-education, friendship, and then we can actually get to policy. Describe that for us.
Yes, so I think it's so important that the young people last night were very interested in learning more about how we could work on racial reconciliation. And I think the first and most important thing is, as you said, Boyd, education. The people need to understand the racial history of the United States and to understand the things that were done in the past and how they resonate today. That the past isn't really past at all, that we're still dealing with the consequences of that. And I would really strongly recommend a book, The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, to get an understanding of the role that racial differences in house purchases made in wealth gaps now, and how that continues to resonate. So first thing is, let's educate ourselves. But then, as I went on to say, I think it's really important to build those friendships and those relationships so that we can have empathy and understanding, and out of that can flow good policy that can change the future.
I love it. It is changing the future. And you've been both of you have been part of these crucial conversations, building friendship across faith traditions into the public sector as well. And Reverend Rivers, I want to go to you. From your unique perch from the Black Church, we've talked a lot about religious liberty. The Supreme Court has weighed in a number of things. What does religious liberty look like from your perspective?
Well, see, it's interesting. Within the context of the Black church tradition, from slavery to the present, we've had a slightly different nuance. We talk about religious freedom, right? It's an interesting distinction, right? And from the Black church's perspective, religious freedom has been the basis, the pursuit, the exercise of religious freedom has been the basis for our development as a community. You see, it was the Black churches that were the key institutions of Black civil society that laid the foundation for the creation of Black colleges, Bible colleges, economic development, and so the sacred institutions were organized by slaves and the descendants of slaves to serve secular and civic purposes. And so the faith-based worldview, which provides the greatest kind of moral vision for the country, no matter what group you're in, is so essential. And so from point of view of the black church, the exercise of our religious freedom had positive secular consequences.
Yeah,
you know,
love that.
And so we're thankful. We are so thankful for the Church of the Latter-day Saints and the kind of support. And here again, another extraordinary example of faith-based institutions serving secular purposes to enhance the comity and the civility of the nation.
Yeah. Oh, love that. Dr. Rivers, I want to go back to you. And both of you have done this so amazingly in really reclaiming language, biblical language, spiritual language, inspirational language,
That's right.
so that we can have a different kind of conversation on the complex and challenging issues of our day.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it really is important that we continue to work towards the point that we just discussed, Boyd. How do we talk together in respectful ways? How do we develop language that really affirms each other? How do we listen to each other? And in meeting with young people on Thursday, we talked about the fact that listening to other people opens the door to being able to share your story. And that builds a whole new level of understanding and mutual engagement.
Yeah, I think that's such an important part of that process. And we're going to stay with that conversation, and we're going to dig into a couple of other important things. You've been so involved in helping lift people out of poverty, dealing with that in the inner city. We'll talk a little bit about fathers and that role in society, as well as looking at some of the things we've marked the 60th anniversary of Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech.
Right.
And often, most people can quote that part of the speech and miss the real depth and meaning beyond that, that has some of those principles we've not lived up to, that we profess to believe. So we're going to stay with the conversation.
Absolutely.
So we will continue our conversation here on Sunday Edition on KSL 5 TV with Dr. Rivers and Reverend Rivers. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Sunday Edition. We're staying with the question just a little longer, which is what we love to do on this program. We're staying with our guests from the Seymour Institute for Black Church and Policy Studies, Dr. Jacqueline Rivers and Reverend Eugene Rivers. And as we marked just before the break, it's been 60 years since Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered that famous I Have a Dream speech. But again, so many miss the rest of the story. And I want to get to some of the rest of the story. One of the things that you mentioned in your address at the Wheatley Institute, Dr. Rivers, was this idea. Dr. King said, you know, it's not sufficient if blacks are moving from a small ghetto to a larger ghetto. And you've done some real deep dive study on that. Give us some perspective.
Yes, so I think it's really important that people understand that Dr. King was advocating for greater economic equality, and that one of the key drivers of economic equality is residential segregation. And so we have the opportunity to really begin to reevaluate that. How do we, because most recent studies, as recently as 2016, show that even if you have the same income level as someone who's white, if you're black, you don't get to live in an equally nice neighborhood. And sociologists have shown that out of that flows lack of access to good quality education, lack of access to jobs, lack of access to good public services. It really means a lower quality of life. So it's a really urgent question for us to address, and we have an opportunity now to begin to reevaluate that and figure out how do we impact residential segregation.
Yeah, it's so important, and part of that whole process, Abraham Lincoln knew that it wasn't just access to capital, it was access to social capital, it was access to people and relationships.
Oh, yes.
And Reverend Rivers, you've done a lot of work on this as it relates to family, as it relates to fathers and that connection. Give some insight there.
One of the things that's most important, and the faith communities can play a singular role in the country, is it's resurrecting the idea of the importance of fatherhood. And see, the black church is in a strategically unique position because our communities are the ones most adversely affected by the father absence, number one. Number two, as the premier sovereign institution of Black America, the Black church, even now, we must work to articulate forcefully the primary importance of fatherhood. And we're in a unique position to go against all of the anti-male feminism and all the other ideological things that are now in circulation. And our contention is we must resurrect the image of Father. For us as Christians, you know, Jesus says, this is how you ought to pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Yeah. So if Jesus says, puts his stamp of approval on fatherhood, that's the bottom line. That's it.
That's a great place to start.
And so what the black churches must do, working in collaboration with others, is build a pro-fatherhood movement.
Yeah.
There needs to be, and the faith-based institutions are uniquely qualified because ain't nobody run up in nobody's church and tell them what that man's gonna preach. So we have the institutional, spiritual, and cultural autonomy and power to articulate as a countervailing influence in the society. And so we just gotta, listen, God has blessed us in faith-based institutions, and now we have to mobilize our spiritual and cultural capital to advance a vision which defends, for me, first the fatherhood of God and the importance of fatherhood in the community.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. One of the other things that Dr. King got to was the urgency of now. That the idea that we can't just go along with incrementalism, that we really have to get past these jangling discords and all of that. And one of the things that both of you have focused on in terms of those dealing with poverty is looking at their identity, which you spoke to so eloquently, Dr. Rivers, that these are not liabilities to be managed. These are people with individual identity and infinite potential. Give us some perspective in terms of how should we be approaching that to really lift everyone?
So that's really an important point, Boyd, because even looking back to this question of fatherhood, so much depends on the education that people are able to access. So to fulfill that potential and to recognize all that young black men can be, they need education, because research has shown that if they don't graduate from high school, that young black men and young white men as well, who don't graduate from high school, have a much higher likelihood of being incarcerated. And that puts them in a position where they're not able to play the role of husbands and fathers as they ought. So to realize that potential that you're talking about, Boyd, we in society need to be thinking about how we educate our young men, especially young black men.
Yeah, so important. And Reverend Rivers, of course, to me, one of the most powerful things is that out of the mountain of despair, a stone of hope. Stone of hope. So important. Give us one thing, just real quickly, that you think we ought to be thinking about, something we ought to be doing differently to create that hope and that connection in the country.
Excellent point. One of the most important things that needs to happen and can happen is the faith communities, the adults, the spiritual and intellectual adults of the faith communities must come together, because we are the last best hope. If you pay any attention to what's going on in the country, as the kids would say, we are off the hook with the wire cut. And so we need faith leaders, and we're so thankful to the Church of Latter-day Saints for the moral support and their commitment to genuine reconciliation. So, number one, black churches and the white Christian community, and we look to the LDS for leadership, have to begin a dialogue, because right now, the only game left in America to keep this thing from going over the edge are the faith communities.
Love that.
And our dialogue.
Yeah, that dialogue is so crucial. Well, we appreciate both of you being here in the state of Utah, joining with the Wheatley Institute for an extraordinary evening and a crucial conversation. We appreciate your friendship, and we hope this is just the not the beginning of the end, but the end of a beginning of more great conversations to come. Thank you so much for your leadership, for showing us what leadership really looks like and sounds like.
Amen.
Thank you so much, Boyd.
God bless you. Thank you for this honor.
So good to be with you. Well, coming Coming up, we're going to explore the fallout from Utah Senator Mitt Romney's announcement that he would not seek re-election, what the senator got right, and lessons that most political people in power miss. When Sunday Edition continues, stay with us. Well, from the moment Utah Senator Mitt Romney announced that he would not seek re-election, there's been a flurry of sensational social media posts, a host of clickbait headlines, and hours of cable news chatter. All kinds of speculation has been spewed about Romney's comments regarding his colleagues and presidents, evaluations of his time and impact in the United States Senate, and all kinds of prognostication about the next race to replace here in the state of Utah. Lost in all of it, of course, was the real important principle and lesson of the day. Exploring the principle and lessons requires you to set aside your personal politics relating to Senator Romney, whether you love him or whether you hate him, whether you're a liberal or conservative, Republican or Democrat, or anything in between. There's actually a message we all should be thinking about relating to every elected official, and I believe every elected official should act on the principle and lesson. Senator Romney was an equal opportunity offender in his announcement, decrying the current and former occupant of the Oval Office for trying to hold on to power while being unwilling or unable to lead. He said it was time for a new generation of leaders to solve the problems that generation will actually have to live with. In his announcement, Senator Romney, in essence, and more importantly, said, "I have confidence in the country and the American people and the citizens of Utah. I don't have to stay in the Senate forever." Our first president, George Washington, understood, and Mitt Romney modeled, what it means to recognize the fallacy of the irreplaceable. George Washington was an extraordinary leader, among the greatest in all of human history. Following the Revolutionary War, he had access to absolute power. He could have been, and scores of Americans wanted him to be, king. Many declared him to be indispensable and irreplaceable. Sadly, most men and women hearing such accolades of indispensability actually listen to that siren song and assume it's a choir of angels, and then they begin to believe it and act on it. Washington knew better and rejected the throne of irreplaceability while setting a standard of servant leadership and stewardship for everyone to follow. You know, I regularly saw the fallacy of the irreplaceable in my work as an international business consultant. Whenever I heard an executive say, "Oh, Mary's irreplaceable," or "Steve's indispensable," I knew there might actually be a problem. I would respond to such statements by asking, well, what happens if Mary quits tomorrow, or Steve tragically gets hit by a bus? This usually drew some pretty nervous laughter or a long moment of silence as the executive realized the fallacy, the risk, and the actual irresponsibility of allowing someone to become irreplaceable. Now, that's not to say that some people aren't harder to replace or that their absence wouldn't be more difficult to overcome. The irreplaceable, I found, often became a constraining force for innovation, for growth and improvement in the organization. It also inhibited the development of other leaders. It created a dependency culture, and in many instances undermined the mental muscle and personal commitment of everyone else inside the company or organization. Sadly, the American people have also begun to buy into this indispensable, irreplaceable leader syndrome. Currently, the United States Congress has an approval rating that hovers somewhere around 9 to 14%. Yet incumbents in Congress are regularly reelected at a rate of over 90% each election cycle. That's a big number. Despite the prospects of a repeat Biden-Trump presidential election in 2024 and the usual chance of drain the swamp, the status quo has regularly been maintained in the U.S. House and Senate, with few seats changing hands and even fewer changes in the leadership of either political party. So in that sense, Senator Romney passed the true test of leadership, especially political leadership, in my view, because we perpetually see those running for re-election who are so desperate to maintain their vice grip hold on power even long after their used-by date in office has actually expired. It's easy for the politicians to convince constituents they can't survive without them. Ultimately, this ends in an imperial presidency with their political pals and pawns running and often ruining the nation. This never ends well for everyday citizens. A quick glance at Venezuela, Russia, North Korea, or a host of other authoritarian regimes provides perspective where the irreplaceable leader transforms into a tyrannical dictator. If we begin to view political leaders as replaceable, they will be. Political elections will become less consequential to our lives because political power will become less consequential in our lives. During my time in Washington, D.C., I regularly walked through the Capitol Rotunda very late at night. I would always pause and spend a few moments gazing at the majestic painting of General George Washington resigning his commission. In the quiet and stillness of the empty rotunda, you can actually hear and sense and know the principles that made Washington an authentic and an extraordinary leader. For any would-be leader, political or otherwise, the date of December 23rd, 1783 is the day worth noting, remembering, and studying. Because it was on that day, in the ultimate act of servant leadership, General George Washington resigned his commission before the Continental Congress. In one of the few instances in history, the commander of the conquering forces did not assume complete authority, control, and power, but instead returned it to the citizens and their representatives. George Washington clearly understood that power is not something to amass, barter with, or cling to, nor is it a tool for pursuing political purposes and self-promotion. While many proclaimed him to be indispensable and irreplaceable, Washington knew that the future of the nation was dependent not on him. He believed America's destiny would be secured down through the ages by individual citizens who would enter the world stage, make a contribution in their homes and communities and country, and then travel on. It's individual Americans living and applying indispensable truths and irreplaceable principles that guarantee America will remain a nation indivisible with liberty and justice and opportunity for all. Everyone has a role to play. Everyone is important. And everyone's replaceable, because it's not about politicians or political parties, it's about people and principles. Senator Romney showed in his decision to step aside something powerful and meaningful that I wish more in our nation's capital would actually follow. It really is the ultimate statement that should give every American hope that it's not who leads us, but what leads us, what principles, what character, what faith that actually matters the most. Senator Romney reminded the nation that service to country was designed to be seasonal work. You come in, you work for a season, and then you move on. You leave a legacy. George Washington demonstrated, go home, make a difference there with no title and no power or position required. I think Senator Romney got it right. Everyone's replaceable, and there is actually a proper time and way to say goodbye. Thanks for watching us on Sunday Edition. I am Boyd Matheson. And as always, as you go out into the world today, make sure you see something that inspires, say something that uplifts, and do something that makes a difference. Music and the spoken word is next.